Thousands of years ago, humanity attempted something extraordinary, a structure so ambitious, so immense, that it was said to reach the heavens, a tower built by a united civilization, driven by vision, power, and belief. It dominated the horizon, rising above the desert like a staircase to the sky, and then it vanished. No ruins, no towering monument, only a story passed down through generations. But what if that story was inspired by something very real? According to the book of Genesis, after the great flood, humanity spoke a single language. United by speech and purpose, they settled in a vast plain in the land of Shinar, ancient Mesopotamia. There they decided to build a city and at its center, a tower tall enough to reach the heavens. The text tells us this was an act of unity, but also of ambition, to make a name for themselves. Then, according to the story, something dramatic occurred. Languages were confused. People could no longer understand one another. The unified society fractured, and the tower was abandoned. For centuries, this account has been interpreted as a theological lesson about pride and divine authority. But historians, archaeologists, and linguists have asked a different question. What if the legend was rooted in memory? What if the story of Babel was inspired by a real structure, one that once stood at the center of a powerful ancient civilization? In the heart of Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, stood one of the greatest cities of the ancient world, Babylon. Founded more than 4,000 years ago, Babylon became a center of trade, law, science, and architecture. Under kings like Hammurabi and later Nebuchadnezzar II, the city expanded dramatically. Massive defensive walls surrounded it. Temples and palaces filled its interior. Ancient writers described it as one of the wonders of the world, but at the center of Babylon stood something even more imposing, a massive step tower known as a ziggurat. Unlike pyramids, ziggurats were not tombs. They were sacred platforms built to elevate temples closer to the gods. These structures symbolized the connection between earth and sky. One ziggurat in particular stands out in historical records. Its name was Etemenanki. The name is often translated as the house of the foundation of heaven and earth. The symbolism is striking, a structure that unites heaven and earth, a tower rising toward the sky. Could this have been the origin of the Babel story? Ancient texts suggest that Etemenanki may have reached nearly 90 meters in height. For comparison, that would have made it one of the tallest structures in the world at the time. Constructed in multiple stages, the tower rose in terraces, each level smaller than the one below. At the top likely stood a temple dedicated to Marduk, the chief god of Babylon. From a distance, the structure would have appeared monumental. To travelers approaching the city across the flat Mesopotamian plain, it must have seemed almost impossible, a geometric mountain of brick and stone rising from the desert, a man-made axis between humanity and the divine, and yet today nothing of its full height remains. Babylon's history was turbulent. The city was conquered by the Assyrians, later reclaimed and rebuilt, then conquered again by the Persians. By the time Alexander the Great entered Babylon in the 4th century BCE, the Great Ziggurat had already fallen into disrepair. Historical accounts suggest Alexander intended to restore it, but the project was never completed. Over time, its bricks were dismantled and reused in other buildings. Erosion weakened its structure. Wind and sand slowly buried what remained. Unlike the pyramids of Egypt built from stone, Babylon's monumental architecture relied heavily on mud brick, durable but not eternal. And so, over centuries, the Great Tower faded from the skyline. Its physical presence erased, its memory transformed into legend. But what about the language? The Babel narrative centers not just on architecture, but on speech. The idea that humanity once shared a single language. Modern linguistics tells us that languages evolve gradually. They branch from earlier roots. Proto-languages give rise to families: Indo-European, Afro-Asiatic, Sino-Tibetan, each tracing back thousands of years. There is no evidence of a single global language at one fixed moment in recorded history. Yet the concept of linguistic unity is not entirely impossible in small early populations. So perhaps the story is symbolic. Perhaps it reflects the memory of a powerful centralized culture, unified politically and culturally rather than linguistically. When that unity collapsed, diversity followed. The confusion of tongues may represent social fragmentation, a metaphor, not a miracle. Another possibility is political interpretation. Babylon was a symbol of power. To some neighboring cultures, it represented excess, domination, and imperial ambition. The biblical authors may have reframed Babylon's monumental tower as an example of human arrogance, a story warning against centralized power. In this view, the Tower of Babel becomes less about engineering and more about ideology, cultural memory transformed into moral narrative. So, what are we left with? We know Babylon existed. We know monumental ziggurats stood at its center. We know one in particular, Etemenanki, may have reached extraordinary heights. We know it eventually collapsed and disappeared. We know ancient writers described its grandeur, and we know that centuries later, a story emerged about a tower reaching heaven built in Mesopotamia, abandoned after human unity shattered. Coincidence? Perhaps, or perhaps legend and history intertwine. Because throughout human civilization, reality often becomes myth. Structures fall, empires crumble, but stories endure. Today, beneath the sands of modern Iraq, fragments of Babylon still lie buried. Archaeologists continue to excavate foundations and inscriptions, but the full shape of the Great Tower may never be fully reconstructed. Its height, its appearance, its exact purpose still debated. And maybe that uncertainty is what keeps the story alive. The Tower of Babel stands at the intersection of faith, history, and archaeology. Not fully provable, not fully dismissible, a reminder that ancient civilizations were capable of extraordinary ambition, and that sometimes the line between myth and memory is thinner than we imagine. So was the Tower of Babel real, a literal skyscraper of the ancient world? A symbolic political message, a memory reshaped by time? We may never know, but somewhere beneath the sands of Mesopotamia, the foundation of heaven and earth may still be waiting. Sometimes history leaves behind stories, not structures. Welcome to Mysteria Mundi.